Money makes the Ukraine war go round. Russia is well aware of this, which is why it's gone to such great lengths to build a shadow fleet that keeps oil money coming into the country, even as the West weighs Russia down with sanctions. However, there's a windfall of cash that Russia wants, but it can't get. The frozen Russian assets being kept by countries that have sanctioned Russia. Right now, those assets are in limbo. They're not being given back to Russia, but their holders also haven't committed to giving them to Ukraine. Now those assets may be about to change the Ukraine war forever. Germany's next move will screw Russia beyond repair, and it's all due to money that Russia believes should be returned. On September 17th, Bloomberg reported momentum to expand the use of frozen assets. This momentum shift is a result of growing pressure from US President Donald Trump to sort out the complex financial situation that revolves around the Ukraine war. Specifically, Trump has called for all Russian oil purchases made by NATO and the European Union or EU countries to stop. Europe may not see the handing over of Russia's frozen assets to Ukraine as a move to buy time so that Trump's desired oil boycott can be implemented over a longer timeframe. Right now, Bloomberg says the Group of Seven or G7 nations are looking closely at various ways they can use the frozen assets to benefit Ukraine. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is among those looking for a way to make those assets usable, as she revealed in a speech earlier in September. We need to work urgently on a new solution to finance Ukraine's war effort on the basis of the immobilized Russian assets, von der Leyen said during her State of the EU address. With the cash balances associated to these Russian assets, we can provide Ukraine with a reparations loan. That's one idea, sure, but one of the EU's most influential nations may have other ideas. Bloomberg says that Germany has emerged as one of the EU members that is now advocating for the frozen assets to be used in whatever way possible to help Ukraine. This is a massive turnaround, as Germany had previously been cautious of doing anything with those assets due to its position as one of Europe's most important financial hubs. Now, Bloomberg claims people who have spoken to the outlet under condition of anonymity say that Germany wants to maximize the return on those frozen funds. Berlin's shift comes amid concerns that if US support under Trump wanes, the burden of backing Ukraine would fall heavily on Europe's largest economy, which could further fuel the rise of Germany's far right, Bloomberg claims. But there's a caveat. Though Germany is looking into as many options as possible for better use of the frozen Russian assets, the one thing that it isn't going to do is confiscate those assets and deliver them directly to Ukraine. Confiscation is what the United States, along with several Eastern European countries, is pushing for, Bloomberg reports. So if confiscation is off the table, the question has to be asked, what would maximizing the use of the frozen funds end up looking like? A few ideas are already floating around, Politico reported on September 12th. One of those ideas comes from the European Commission, which says that one potential option would be to replace the frozen assets the EU currently holds with EU-backed bonds. Those bonds would essentially act as IOUs for Russia. In other words, the bonds would allow the EU to release the frozen Russian money they hold to Ukraine, giving that country some much-needed cash flow to help it buy Western weapons and build up its domestic weapon production industry. The bonds would also act as an EU guarantee to Russia that it will eventually get the money back, though that would likely only happen if Putin ends his war, relinquishes all attempts to end Ukraine's sovereignty, and returns Russia to a more moderate position. Politico says that the proposal has gained cautious enthusiasm behind the scenes in the EU. Specifically, the outlet says the idea is being floated as Ukraine is likely to face an estimated €8 billion budget shortfall in 2026. That amounts to nearly $8.6 billion, and it's a shortfall that could be avoided if the EU were able to release some of the frozen Russian assets. Right now, the assets are being held by a financial market infrastructure provider named Euroclear. Under Euroclear's rules, maturing assets have to be transferred to a deposit account within the European Central Bank, Politico says. Those assets generate interest. The EU has been using that interest to repay the balance of a $53 billion loan that has been granted to Ukraine. The problem is that this loan will soon be entirely paid out, which means the G7, which provided the loan, has to figure out what to do next. Creating a similar loan vehicle is an option. However, as Politico notes, now that Ukraine is running out of money, the Commission has suggested using those cash deposits at the ECB to fund a reparations loan to help prop up the war-torn country in the years to come. Here's the kicker. Ukraine would only have to pay this type of loan back when Russia has paid reparations for the damage it's done to Ukraine. This would amount to a clever little trick by the EU and the G7. The total cost of rebuilding Ukraine was estimated to be $524 billion in February and has likely increased since. So Russia paying for reparations would essentially mean Russia pays back the loan that would allow Ukraine to access more of Russia's frozen assets. The idea is a real punch to the gut for Putin. And we'll cover Russia's opinion on all of this debate over what to do with the frozen assets later in the video. Still, this is just one idea, an idea that hasn't received approval and is still being mulled over, alongside others, as the EU considers what to do with the billions of Russian dollars that it has frozen. As is often the EU way, more talking will have to take place before any action is taken. Bloomberg says the topic of what to do with the assets will likely be raised during a meeting between EU finance ministers in Copenhagen, which is set to take place in September and October. The anonymous officials who spoke to Bloomberg say that the ideal situation will be for an idea to be agreed upon by the time the EU leaders summit rolls around on October 23rd. All of this brings us back to Germany. It's emerged as a clear advocate of coming up with a new way to use the frozen Russian assets. Pravda points out that there is some self-interest at play here. Berlin's shift follows concerns that if US support under Trump diminishes, the burden of supporting Ukraine would fall heavily on Germany's economy, the largest in Europe, possibly increasing support for German far-right parties, the outlet reports. While the political shift might be worrying for some, far more concerning to Germany is the prospect of having to send even more military aid to Ukraine out of its own coffers. This isn't to say that Germany hasn't already been generous. Latest reports say that the country's total aid bill so far is $87.5 billion as of early September 2025. Of the $87.5 billion, more than $30 billion has been military aid, with the rest being humanitarian and similar non-military forms of donations. These donations place Germany second, behind the US in first, behind the US. The challenge Germany faces is that the withdrawal of financial support from the US would mean the loss of a donor that has given Ukraine about $135 billion, per the Kiel Institute Ukraine War Financial Aid Tracker. Somebody will have to fill the financial gap if the US decides to send no more aid. Germany doesn't want to have to be the country that foots the majority of the bill. So if Germany is now pushing for the frozen assets to be used more effectively after a long period of reticence, the question has to be asked: just how much influence will Germany have in this decision? When it comes to Russian assets held, Germany as an individual country holds a fairly small amount of the total frozen assets. In May 2024, Reuters reported that Germany holds Russian assets valued at about $4.2 billion, which is a figure that includes the assets of companies and individuals that have been subjected to Western sanctions. While this is a substantial amount of money, it's less than 2% of the total $300 billion plus in frozen Russian assets that are being held throughout the world. But here's the rub. Though Germany as an individual country holds a relatively small amount of Russia's frozen money, Germany is also one of the most powerful nations in the EU, and it's the EU that holds the lion's share of the frozen assets, with about $207 billion of the total, according to reports from 2023. The US holds $67 billion, Reuters said in 2023, with the UK, Japan, Canada, and Australia also holding several billions of dollars. It's the EU's portion of the assets that's really important here, both because it's the largest portion and it's the portion over which Germany could exercise the most control outside of the assets the country itself holds. If the German desire to see the frozen assets used in a new way to benefit Ukraine is to be realized, the country may need to rely on its prominent role inside the EU as leverage to unleash as much of the $207 billion the collective holds. It could do that. Germany is one of the most powerful EU countries in several ways. It was a founding member of the European coal and steel community that would eventually morph into the EU as we know it today. Germany is the EU's most populous country, and it has the bloc's largest economy. 96 German politicians currently sit in the European Parliament, which accounts for more than 10% of the maximum of 720 seats that the current parliament allows. Germany is also the largest net contributor to the EU's collective funds, plus Ursula von der Leyen, who is the European Commission president we mentioned earlier, is German. That's a lot of leverage that Germany can use to get its way if it decides to make a hard push for the EU to unleash the $200 billion it holds in frozen Russian assets, even if it is just as part of a new mechanism that technically doesn't just give those assets to Ukraine. It's also possible that the US and Canada will follow suit if the EU makes the first move toward making better use of the frozen assets. As the Atlantic Council revealed in April, both the US and Canada have introduced legislation that would empower their governments to outright confiscate the frozen assets they currently hold. According to some reports, there are also voices in the US calling for all of the money to be handed to Ukraine, as demonstrated by a March 21st letter through which several US senators called on the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio to give those funds to Ukraine. The point here is that the US may be willing to make a move if the EU makes one. Germany could use that point, along with its own massive leverage within the EU, to get its way when it comes to providing Ukraine with more of the money from the $200 billion plus in frozen assets the collective holds. By this point, you may be asking yourself a question. If these are Russian assets, why aren't they just being delivered to Ukraine? Surely Germany and the rest of the EU don't care about angering a country that is already showcasing so much aggression toward it. Why aren't these assets being used already? They are, kind of. We mentioned earlier that the G7 already has a program in place that allows it to provide money to Ukraine in the form of a loan that centers around the Russian assets. That loan was agreed in June 2024, and it sees the G7 group of nations paying about €3 billion per year to Ukraine, which is the amount of interest that the frozen Russian assets generate annually. That's all well and good, but as we mentioned earlier, Ukraine is staring down the barrel of a budget deficit in 2026, and €3 billion, as useful as it may be, isn't enough to cover that deficit. There have been suggestions within the EU of moving the assets it holds into riskier investments, which could then generate higher returns. Of course, more risk comes with the possibility of losses that would eliminate a chunk of the assets, raising the ire of Russia and limiting the amount of money the assets generate if they're returned to safer investments. Regardless, the point is that up until now, the G7 has been using the frozen assets in a way that doesn't involve actually spending the money that still belongs to Russia. And that brings us to why these assets haven't just been given to Ukraine. There's certainly a moral argument to be made that Russia's frozen assets should just go straight to Ukraine, especially given the scale and cost of the damage that has been done to the country since Putin invaded. Ukraine could certainly make good use of the money, especially in its domestic defense industry, which it says could be accelerated massively with a cash injection of $30 billion. However, as CNN reported in March, there are two major barriers to the approach of just handing the frozen assets to Ukraine. The first is the dangerous economic precedent such a move might set, which could eventually damage Europe. If the EU sets a standard of seizing the frozen assets of countries with which it disagrees, that will give any foreign investor who considers building reserves of the euro a serious pause for thought. Take China, for instance. CNN notes that China is already aware that it would likely face EU sanctions if it chooses to invade Taiwan, which many believe it's preparing to do within the next few years. If those sanctions are accompanied by the EU handing over frozen Chinese assets to Taiwan, the odds are that China will quickly pull whatever money it has already invested out of the continent and will refuse to invest any more in the future. Simply put, Europe doesn't want to harm the status of the euro as a reserve currency. This economic barrier would have to be overcome if any of Russia's frozen assets are to be delivered to Ukraine, and that would require the EU to collectively decide that it's willing to accept the economic consequences of that action. However, if we take this potential economic blowback out of the equation, nothing changes the fact that the frozen assets still belong to Russia. The potential seizure of these assets doesn't change that fact, which means there is a dicey legal barrier that would also have to be overcome if the assets are to be delivered to Ukraine. CNN notes that the immunity of a state's overseas assets from seizure is a key facet of international law. The Spectator adds that Russia would inevitably challenge such a seizure in international courts, meaning the EU, the US, Germany, and whoever else decides to seize would have to come up with a defense. And even if an adequate defense is created, the Russian assets would likely have to remain frozen while Russia's case is pending. There will be nothing stopping Putin from dragging this case out for years, essentially making the decision to seize pointless. There are only two ways around this second barrier. Either every frozen Russian asset holder would have to decide to break international law, or the law itself would need to be rewritten, perhaps to allow for asset seizure in extreme circumstances. So it's not as easy as handing the Russian money to Ukraine. That's why Germany is so keen on exploring alternatives such as the IOU mechanism we discussed earlier. That would offer a way to ensure Ukraine gets far more than €3 billion per year out of Russia's assets while technically ensuring those assets aren't outright handed over. Then there's what Russia thinks about all of this. Back in February, when ceasefire negotiations were just beginning and discussions were being had on what Ukraine and Russia might cede to one another, several sources told Reuters that Russia might agree to give up the frozen assets. That would only be done on condition that the money was spent on the parts of the country that Russia occupies, and it's pretty well known that Ukraine ceding that territory to Russia is part of the peace deal that Putin wants. So this wouldn't be Russia giving $300 billion to Ukraine. It will be Russia claiming that money for itself to rebuild the parts of Ukraine that it has destroyed and now controls. That idea hasn't gone anywhere, unsurprisingly, and Russia is far more combative now that it's learned that Germany is looking for a better way to ensure the frozen assets can benefit Ukraine. The Times of India reported on September 15th that Russia is already cautioning Europe against any attempts to seize its assets to benefit Ukraine, which we have to assume means it is not too happy about the IOU concept that is currently floating around the EU. Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Medvedev has already started flinging threats around after hearing about the reparation loan concept, stating, "If this happens, Russia will pursue the EU states, as well as European degenerates from Brussels and individual EU countries who try to seize our property until the end of the century." That chasing would involve going through every possible court to get the money back, as we suggested earlier, because to Russia, such a move would amount to theft. And on a purely legal basis, Russia would be right, at least if the assets are just handed over to Ukraine. But under the proposed loan mechanism, things could be different. Russia doesn't seem to think so. However, if Germany, and by extension the EU, can make a legal argument that a reparations loan doesn't amount to direct seizure, Ukraine may be in luck. But for now, all Ukraine can do is wait and see. The concept of this unique sort of loan has been floated. It will be a key topic of discussion among the EU's finance ministers in September and October, and Germany, which is the EU power player, says that it wants to find a way to use the frozen assets better than it already does. Russia could be on the verge of being screwed beyond all repair, but it will fight tooth and nail to stop that from happening, no matter what Germany, the G7, and every frozen asset holder come up with. Still, the fate of the frozen assets may be the furthest thing from Putin's mind right now. Poland has just slapped Russia's leader by demanding that NATO close the Ukrainian sky to Russia. Find out more along with what this move would mean in our video, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more updates on whatever happens to Russia's frozen assets. And thank you, as always, for watching.